Before we get started, I just want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. You all are muted when you get on the call, so if you are going to speak, please unmute yourself and then mute yourself back because we do pick up a lot of ambient noise. We are recording, as you have been made aware by Zoom, and we will have this recording up on our YouTube channel generally within 2 business days. Today we had over 30 people sign up, and we generally lose about 50% of those people between sign up and sign in, so we'll see how we do today. A lot of us get double and triple booked, and time just gets away from us these days. We all have the best of intentions when we register, and stuff happens. So toward that end, we do send an e-blast out to a large group of people with the link to the YouTube channel, and generally get several hundred views of what we post there over a period of time. During the cafe, if you have questions that come up as our speaker is speaking, please enter them into the chat. We will have time after the presentation for not only those questions and the Facebook questions, but also people that raise their actual or digital hand on the screen. Toward the end of the cafe, we do have a few moments for your brieflies. Tell us what's new and exciting going on in your business or anything that you want to share. We'll share what's going on at the chamber very briefly. And I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to let Harriet Morgan from University of Washington jump right in and share her screen and tell you a little bit about herself and the Climate Impact Group as well. Harriet, take it away.
Awesome. Okay. Arlene, can you hear me okay? Just give a thumbs up.
Perfectly.
You can? Okay, perfect. All right, let me get this screen share going here. Okay. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about Pacific Northwest climate change science, the impacts of climate change, as well as like risks and vulnerabilities that our region is going to face over the coming century. And I think it's really important to get these details of what the science has to say about the local impacts of climate change, because what it's going to do is really just help us understand the importance of both stopping climate change and as well as preparing for the consequences. So I'll talk a little bit about where I work, which is the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. So we're a group at UW that's been working for 25 years. So this is actually our 25th anniversary to connect climate science and decision making. So we help to build climate resilience across the Northwest by advancing awareness of climate risks and by enabling science-based action to manage those risks. And so what our group does is really work to make global science locally relevant, so here in Washington State, and also to make that science actionable so that decision makers, policymakers can take it and actually affect change on the landscape here in the state that we call home. So we're focused on making science that's both useful and actually used in supporting the development of climate resilience across the Pacific Northwest. The Climate Impacts Group is also the university host of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So this center is a USGS university partnership, so a federal university partnership that represents 6 universities across the Northwest, which you can see on this slide here. And this center was established to help safeguard both the natural and cultural resources of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Western Montana. And this is done by producing relevant and accessible science on the climate change impacts and adaptation actions that are really geared towards application for natural resource managers and policymakers in our region. And one exciting piece of new information is that on Monday, we actually announced publicly that we're currently launching the Northwest Climate Resilience Collaborative. So the Climate Impacts Group is working with 9 communities, nonprofits, university partners to launch a program that's going to be community-led. It's going to be justice-oriented climate adaptation work across, again, that same regional geographic space of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. So this climate resilience collaborative is going to be founded by a 5-year, $5.6 million grant from federal NOAA. And this is one of 11 programs that's been funded across the country, and the collaborative is really focused on advancing efforts to adapt to climate change in frontline communities. And those are those communities that have been excluded from spaces of power and who are disproportionately experiencing the impacts of climate change across the Northwest. And I sort of talk about all these centers just to articulate what we're really doing here is doing the hard science to truly understand what the local impacts of climate change will be for the Northwest, the region that we're living in. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on in my time with you today. And the work that we do is always done to really support natural resource managers, planners, policymakers, communities, and businesses in their efforts to prepare for these impacts. So we never sort of squirrel ourselves away and do science that we think is important. It's always co-produced with the end user to ensure that what we're developing and co-developing is actually going to be useful to and used by those end users there. So it's a little bit about me, where I work at the university, and what we're hoping to achieve with our work. So I've structured our time today around 3 sort of deceptively simple questions. So I'm interested in talking about where we are now with regards to climate change, where we're headed, and what our choices are about the future. So let's begin quickly with where are we now? So I think most people realize that global temperatures have warmed. So global average temperatures have increased by about 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times, and close to 100% of that warming since 1950 is the result of human activity. And what you're seeing in this graph below, the green line shows atmospheric carbon dioxide increasing from about 290 parts per million, which is how that concentration is measured in the atmosphere. So that's 290 back in 1880, and that increases to about 410 parts per million today. And that blue line shows global average temperature increasing approximately like 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 1 degree Celsius during that same time period. So that's what we're talking about at the global level. And sort of more to the point, we see the consequences of this warming unfolding around us in our communities every day. And we're also seeing it in the news. So just this past summer, as I'm sure you all remember, we had that record-shattering heat wave in the Northwest that had significant consequences to human health. We had significant loss of life, impacts to natural resources, infrastructure, agriculture. Last year in the 2020s, on the East Coast, there was 5 hurricanes in the Atlantic at once. We've also seen communities on the east side of the United States be blanketed with wildfire smoke from fires out in the West. And July of 2021 was the hottest month ever recorded, or in our recorded history record for the planet. So we are seeing the consequences of climate change unfold around us. And drilling it down to a little bit more of a local level, in the Northwest, we've seen average annual temperatures increase more than 2 degrees since the late 1800s. And we've also seen many local consequences of that warming here in the Northwest. So we've seen our spring snowpack that we're really reliant on for water for our farms, our fish, and our cities. We've seen declines in that. Our glaciers are shrinking. The timing of our stream flow is changing in our rivers, so that natural water availability is shifting. We're seeing sea level rise affecting our coastlines, that I'm sure all of you in Jefferson County are very well aware of. And we're seeing different rates of sea level rise around the coast, depending on local vertical land movement, which I can talk about a little bit more later. We're also seeing our coastal waters are both warming and acidifying. And we're also seeing the number of large fires in area burned in the Northwest increasing over the past 20 years. And more broadly across the entire Western US, fuels for those fires are drier, in part because of human-caused warming. And the hard part about all of what I'm talking about today is that we're headed towards much more significant change. one of the questions that we frequently get asked by reporters or the media is it going to get worse? And the answer is yes, it's going to get worse because we haven't stopped climate change yet. So unfortunately, until we do, we are on the path towards much larger change. So the current projections are that if our current rates of warming continue, global warming could reach 1.5 degrees Celsius as soon as 2030. And why do we care about 1.5 degrees Celsius? What's special about that? Well, the important thing about 1.5 degrees C of warming is that it's been identified by the international scientific community as a dangerous level of climate change that we would really like to try and avoid. So unfortunately, we are on track to actually more warming than that, as you can see by this graph here. So back in November of 2019, the UN Environment Program published a report stating that this 1.5 degrees Celsius climate target is slipping out of reach. And the report notes that greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise. They reached record levels back in 2018, which was the year before this report was published. And despite the slight slowing of emissions during 29 as a result of economic shutdowns related to COVID, greenhouse concentrations in the atmosphere are continuing to rise. And so limiting that warming at the global level to 2 degrees C would require significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the main takeaways from this report is that the longer we wait, the more severe those emission reductions need to be. So we are currently on track for over 3 degrees C of warming this century. So that 3.2 degrees C you see there in my slide, that equates to 5.8 degrees Fahrenheit of warming by the end of the 21st century. So for the for the rest of my talk, I want to focus on climate change in the Northwest, the actual changes that we are expecting in our physical environment, and then the consequences of those changes for our natural systems, our communities, and our businesses. So similar to what's projected for the globe, rapid warming is projected here in the Northwest. So this figure shows historical temperature with that black and gray line. And then we have two scenarios of future warming through the 21st century. So the blue line is the low emission scenario, which reflects a future that we could choose if we dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and actually remove them from the atmosphere. And the red line there is the high emissions scenario. So by the 2050s, Washington state is projected to see warming of around 4 degrees or around 6 degrees, depending on which scenario unfolds. We can also talk about other aspects of projected change in climate for the Northwest. So beyond just average annual temperature, we also expect to see more extreme heat events. The hottest years in the 21st century will be warmer than those that we've experienced in the past century. We expect to see projected increases in heavy rainfall events, so those downpours that we occasionally experience. And as a result of that warming, we're also going to see declines in snowpack and earlier melt of that snow in our mountains. And this has really significant consequences for Washington state, because our mountain snowpack is a really important reservoir of water that we depend on to transfer water from the wet winter month to the dry summer months, where we really need that for farms and towns, as well as natural resources like salmon. We also expect to see ongoing sea level rise, higher high flows in streams during the winter months, and lower low flows during summer. I'll dig into the hydrologic impacts a bit more in a moment, but one quick hand way to remember how climate change is expected to affect our hydrologic system in Washington is that climate change is going to bring us more water when we don't need it in the winter, and it's going to give us less water when we do need it in those summer months. And on top of all of these projected changes, we're still going to have natural climate variability. We're still going to have hotter years, cooler years, and we're still going to have wetter years and drier years. But this natural variability is going to occur on top of that climate change signal. So one of the consequences, as I mentioned, of these changes is increased flooding. And some of our projections show that the highest rivers in Puget Sound's 12 largest rivers are projected to increase between 18 and 55% by the end of the century or the 2080s. And in some basins, we do have like flood control infrastructure to protect our communities and our roadways from these floods. However, in many cases, these structures are simply going to be insufficient to catch these higher flows, this volume of water. We also expect to see the area burned by wildfire in Washington quadruple by the 2040s. And in general, we expect to see longer fire seasons, bigger fires across the West as a result of climate change. So I've just talked through two of the major pathways by which climate is going to unfold in the region. One is through water availability and both shifts in the timing and delivery of that water. And the second is through wildfire and the transformation of our forest ecosystems that this change is going to drive. And the third major driver of climate change in our region is sea level rise, which is accelerating in our region. And depending on the emission scenario that you're looking at or the future that we decide to take together as a society, we will see different amounts of sea level rise in Washington state. So I'm going to sort of shift gears a tiny bit and do a project spotlight. So this is a tool that I helped develop that allows individuals and local decision makers to visualize the projected amounts of sea level rise for 171 different locations along Washington's coastline. So back in 2018, the Climate Impacts Group worked with Washington Sea Grant and Washington Department of Ecology to develop an updated set of sea level rise projections for Washington state. So these currently serve as the best available science for the state. And I'm going to share a little bit about the goals of the visualization and a walkthrough of the different features. And this is something that all of you can access and interact with and explore. Ideally after this presentation, but it's publicly available. So what we ended up doing was developing a tool that ultimately led to two different visualizations. Both allow users to explore how sea level rise is projected to change over time. So our projections go from 2020 out to the year 2150. And we developed independent projections for 171 different locations along Washington's coast. So every 5 to 7 miles along the entire coastline, there's an independent set of projections. And we generated these projections under two different greenhouse gas scenarios. So this first visualization that you see a screen grab of here enables users to explore the projected relative sea level change by year. So basically you'd use this visualization to answer the question, how likely is it that we'll see 1 foot of sea level rise by 2050 at the specific location you've selected? And we also built out this visualization too, which allows users to explore the likelihood of a given sea level change by year. So you'd use visualization 2 if you wanted to ask a slightly different question. When are we expected to see 1.5 feet of sea level rise at our site? And so with that, yeah, I'm going to switch over and pull up this visualization here and just do a quick walkthrough. I can actually get the chat and I can send you this link, which would be nice. So I'm just going to throw this in the chat so you guys should all have that link now. Okay, so what I'm going to do, just for the sake of time, is just walk through visualization 1, which is projected sea level change by year. So when you're using this visualization, the first step that you need to do is zoom into your site of interest. We've built in a variety of different features to enable users to navigate to different areas along Washington's coastline. We have a search feature here. We also can filter by county, which seems appropriate for this audience. So let's go to Jefferson County. Sorry, it needed a refresh. There we go. Okay, so these are all of the line segments that are associated with Jefferson County. So if we zoom in, you can pan and zoom like you would on a typical Google map. So let's just click this one just for example. So once you select your blue line segment of interest, the projections populate on the right side of the visualization here. The next step is to select which likelihood you are interested in. So this is slightly complicated, but the thing to keep in mind is when you're selecting a likelihood, the most important factor to understand is really just the level of risk that's associated with it. So the decision of what, excuse me, likelihood to use is really an institutional decision. There's no right or wrong answer. It's going to depend on a variety of political, financial, and logistical factors that are all going to be specific to your organization, your business, or to the specific decision that you're making. And so what these likelihoods are they're basically probabilities of exceedance, which is a very jargony term. But what it is doing, it's an estimate of the likelihood that sea level rise is going to meet or exceed a particular magnitude by a specific point in the future. So what these, we've used this probabilistic approach because it makes an attempt to quantify how likely different magnitudes of sea level rise are. And that folds in really well to a risk benefit decision-making framework. So that's sort of a rationale behind that there. So in our projections, we have a full probability distribution, but we have our low likelihood projections. So these are low probability sea level rise magnitudes. They're less likely to be exceeded. So these are like the 1% through to the 10%. They're less likely to be exceeded. And they're really appropriate in risk adverse situations. You don't want water or surge events on top of sea level rise getting into your development area. We also have high likelihood, which are high probability sea level rise magnitudes that are more likely to be exceeded. So these would be like 83 to 99. These are appropriate in risk tolerant applications. You know, perhaps you're designing a park or something that can tolerate some inundation during the winter months, and you don't want to design for something that's going to be more robust and likely more expensive. So when I'm exploring a site for the first time, I usually look at the 1%, the 17%, the 83%, and that is it. I'll turn off the 99. So the next decision we need to make, the third step, is to select the greenhouse gas scenario you want to view. So as I stated earlier, we generated these projections under both a low and high greenhouse gas scenarios. So you can view both like it's being done now. I usually just look at one because it cleans up the plots a bit. It cuts the number of lines you're looking at in half. And then the final decision we need to make before diving into the data is this toggle slider over here on the right. So like I mentioned, our projections go out to 2150. But if you'd like to set a specific end year for this graph here, you just drag this slider. So let's say you're only interested out to 2100, and that'll adjust this plot here. So those are pretty much all the decisions that you need to make before really diving into the visualization. And what you can see here is that we've divided it into two sections. On the top here, we have this graph, which is showing projected relative sea level rise over time for this specific coastal line segment in Jefferson County that we've selected. So our y-axis is showing projected change in relative sea level rise. This is in feet. And then our x-axis is showing time out through 2100. That's what we selected here on our toggle, so through the end of the century. And what we have is 4 curves here. And each of these, there's one curve for each of these likelihoods that we selected over here on the left. So we have our 1% curve, which is up here on the top. We have our 17% curve here in the middle. We have our 50% curve and our 83% curve. And those are shown here in our legend. And then the data table below is the same data that's plotted here. It's just shown in tabular form. And so my favorite feature of this visualization is this tooltip function. So if you take your cursor and you hover over one of these data points, you'll notice this sentence pops up. And what this is it just says, it translates the data into a sentence format with a clear takeaway. So this point says, under a high RCP 8.5 greenhouse gas scenario, there's a 1% chance that the amount of relative sea level rise will meet or exceed 2.1 feet by 2060 at this location. And this is done in like a Mad Lib style. So that percent curve that you're looking at here, we see we're looking at the 17% chance, and we have a different magnitude of sea level rise in a different time period. You'll also notice that in the data table below, the likelihood, the year, and the magnitude of heat that we're looking at for this data point are all highlighted, and that changes depending on what data point you're hovering over it there. And so that is visualization number one in a nutshell. What we were really hoping to achieve with this visualization was to enable users to quickly explore the sea level rise data, to allow them to see that projected change through time, and to allow users to easily compare projections between a high greenhouse gas scenario and a low greenhouse gas scenario. Prior to this visualization, we had done all of this in Excel spreadsheets, and I think we ended up developing over 300 Excel spreadsheets and found out very quickly that that is not the way people want to receive their climate data. And so this is a response to a lot of the challenges that wasn't working with those Excel spreadsheets. And I know I don't have time to talk through visualization 2, but it's pretty much identical outside of this one selection column here. So you'll notice rather than selecting a likelihood, what the user is doing is selecting different magnitudes of sea level rise. And what this visualization will tell you is how likely it is that you will see those magnitudes by certain points throughout the 21st century. So say you know a project is being designed to accommodate 1.5 feet of sea level rise, this visualization will allow you to look out and see, well, how likely is it that we will reach that 1.5 foot threshold by 2050, 2070, 2090? So let me flip back to the PowerPoint presentation. I also can't see the chat. So if anyone has questions, I'm not ignoring you. I just can't see the chat right now, so apologies for that. So feel free to unmute if there's a pressing question that you would like answered before we move on. I'll take everyone's silence as me giving a crystal clear presentation. Okay, and before getting back to how climate change is really going to impact a lot of different natural resources, economies, human health, I do want to highlight one more visualization that we've developed. It's not sea level rise related, it's related to extreme precipitation, or these like heavy downpour events, frequently associated with atmospheric rivers or pineapple expresses in the Northwest. So we developed this visualization in collaboration with the city of Portland, city of Gresham, and Clackamas County in Oregon. However, we were able to leverage the funds of these projects to ensure that our projections were available across the entire model domain, which included Washington State. So recent climate research has shown that heavy rain events are projected to become more intense with climate change across the Northwest, and this really has significant implications for stormwater management across our communities. So the general trends in our results show larger projected changes for more extreme events. So for example, when we look at our projected changes in intensity, we see that the projected change in the intensity of the 25-year event is larger than what's being projected for the 2-year event. So larger projected change for more extreme events. And we also see larger projected changes for shorter duration events. So for example, the 1 hour or 2 hour precipitation event is projected to become more intense than what's projected for the 24-hour or the 1 day or the 48-hour or 2-day precipitation event. And I'll do a quick walkthrough of the visualization of this tool as well. Let me hide. So that's what we just looked through. And let me do a refresh here. Okay, so our first step is just get out of this disclaimer. So this gold lattice that you see here is our model domain. So while we worked with jurisdictions down in Oregon, like I said, we were able to leverage the results to produce data for the entire model domain. Each of these are 12 by 12 kilometer grid cells. So the first step is to zoom in to your grid cell of interest. And you can pan and zoom like you would on a normal Google map, just without a search feature. So let's just to do something different, look at Portland. So click on the grid cell. Once you select your grid cell of interest, the screen's going to change and the projections for the selected grid cell will automatically populate on the right side of the screen that you see here. We intentionally designed this to be a pretty clean and simple interface to view projections for each model grid cell. And the tool provides 3 different ways for viewing results. So these 3 different options are shown by these 3 buttons on the left side of the screen here. And with this selection, what you're determining is what metric is being shown on the x-axis of the plot to the right. So you can view projections by duration, which is the default. So duration of a precipitation event is how long the precipitation event lasts. So you could have a 1-hour event, a 6-hour event, a 24-hour event. And you can see we have the 1-hour, 2-hour, 6-hour, 24, 72-hour event. And on our y-axis, what we're looking at is the projections, and they're expressed as a % change in the intensity of that event. And this is % change relative to historical conditions. So the second option is to view the projections by return interval, and a return interval is how common or rare a precipitation event of a specific duration is. So a larger return interval, like something like the 50 or the 100-year, implies a rarer and larger event, where in contrast, the 2-year or the 5-year is a more common and smaller magnitude event, similar to the way we talk about floods, that 100-year flood versus the 10-year flood. And then finally, we can view projections by decade for a given duration return interval ranging from the 2030s out to the 2080s. So let's say we're interested in just doing the default by the different duration of the storms again, 1-hour, 6-hour, 24, 72-hour. Let's say we're interested in the 5-year event, and we're interested in the end of the 21st century, so the 2080s. So here we're looking at the projected change in the intensity of the 5-year return interval precipitation event for the 2080s. We have different durations shown on our x-axis here. These projections are all generated under that high greenhouse gas scenario. And what you'll see is for each duration, we have 12 blue dots. And so each of these blue dots represents a projection from a global climate model. And for each of the durations, there's also this red diamond, and these are what we call model average or model ensemble. It's just an average of those 12 blue dots. And if you hover your cursor over an individual dot or one of the red diamonds, a tooltip will pop up, which just shows some summary information about that data point that you're using. This is very similar to what I talked through with our sea level rise visualization. It's just a feature that we've designed to help decision makers really interpret the data that this tool is providing them. So the final features that we have are these download figures. So you can just download this plot that you've customized. You can download the data that goes into the chart if you want to create your own plot. And you can also download data for this grid cell that we've selected up here. And these features were all requested from those 3 jurisdictions that we worked with to really aid in communication of this climate change information internally within their bureaus. So that is the extreme precipitation tool. I will swap back to my presentation quickly. I appreciate your patience with all my toggling back and forth here. I'll skip that for now. So now I'm going to talk about some of the impacts that we're going to see across our communities. So when we think about sea level rise, temperature, extreme heat, water supply, and changes in wildfire, all of these things are going to reshape our communities and ecosystems, because our communities and ecosystems have been built, or they've really evolved to cope with climate of the past. So climate change really shifts the foundation of everything that we depend on and everything that's really around us. It's going to affect our transportation systems, our drainage systems, our electricity systems, and our buildings. And it brings real threats to critical infrastructure across the Northwest by actually changing physical hazards and reducing the efficacy and lifetime of our built environment. It's going to increase maintenance costs as well as reducing performance standards. And climate change also threatens our natural resource economies in the Northwest. It stresses our agriculture by changing water demand and water supply. We see increases in pests and heat stress, as well as stresses in our fisheries. So our salmon are going to be significantly stressed by changes in the freshwater environment. We're going to see impacts for salmonids, both from the increased floods in winter and the decreased low flows during the summer months, coupled with warmer river temperatures, which are all adding to stress to our threatened and endangered salmon populations, in addition to changes in our coastal environment. And our forest resources are going to be affected by fire, insects, as well as drought. So there's many different impacts that are threatening the natural resource economies of the Northwest. And climate change will also endanger the well-being of a wide range of wildlife, fish and plants, which are intimately tied to tribal subsistence, culture, and popular outdoor recreation activities in Washington state. We can talk about salmon and huckleberries to other first foods, to winter recreation and access to the outdoors that I think is so central to so many of our identities as Washingtonians. Climate change is really going to threaten the natural environment and cultural heritage of our state and of our region. And we can also talk about the numerous impacts of human health and well-being. So we're going to see increases in heat stress, wildfire smoke exposure, increased physical hazards and diseases, all of these impacts are really going to affect frontline communities the worst. So the National Climate Assessment identified tribes and indigenous peoples, those dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods, as well as the economically disadvantaged, as very important frontline communities that will be affected in a significant way by all of these impacts that we've just talked through. And I want to talk a little bit about multiplying effects, because I think at the start of this presentation, we talked about climate impacts on or drivers on different aspects of our environment. And then we just walked through how those might affect different systems that we care about or our communities are centered around. And so here, if we walk through the example of climate change impacts on flooding, we can describe how we have to realize that all of these effects and their consequences aren't going to happen one by one in silos on their own. So when we think about climate change effects or impacts on flooding in the Northwest, there are three important drivers of that. First, as I'm sure many of you know, in Jefferson County, we have sea level rise. Relevant for any place near the coast, but we also know from what we talked through and the visualization I shared that climate change is going to bring heavier precipitation events, and the heaviest rainfall events are projected to increase. So we have heavier precipitation there. In addition, we have declining snowpack that I mentioned, and this is also going to increase flood risk, because when it would have been snowing in the mountains, and historically, it's going to be raining in the future and causing pulses in river flow, combining with heavier precipitation, combining with sea level rise to make much larger impacts. So we've studied some of these combined effects locally. One case study would be the Snohomish River in Washington state. What we found is that by the 2080s, what we used to call the 10-year flood is now projected to occur every 3 years by the 2080s. So it's changing the frequency and the magnitude of those flooding events in Western Washington communities. And the point of all of this is to just articulate that when we think about climate risks, we really have to think about how they interact and overlap. And we also need to think about the consequences of our decisions as a society, and how those intersect with climate risks. So you can't just think about climate impacts on flooding and consequences for communities without also thinking about the degree to which there's development in floodplains, or the degree to which individuals are insured for the losses that they might experience when flooding occurs. And this list could go on. And right, there's many other things that we could highlight in this figure there. So as a result of this, people have called climate change a threat multiplier. And one way we can think about it is that climate change is really just going to be pushing our sore spots as a society. And so we already know we have challenges with flood risks in vulnerable communities, and climate change is really only going to make those worse. And you could do this exercise with a lot of different impacts and see those intersections and see where our weak spots are. And so I'm going to close by talking a little bit about what our choices are going forward. So in a very simple sense, in order to deal with climate change, you need to address both the root cause and also prepare for the consequences. So when we talk about address the root cause, we're talking about that we need to stop emitting greenhouse gases and ultimately work on removing from the atmosphere. So, to be, a very simple way of saying it is that the impacts of climate change are going to just keep getting worse until we stop making climate change worse. So stabilizing temperature at any level is going to require net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And the temperature is going to just continue to go up until we stabilize those greenhouse gas emissions. And our work and my work at the Climate Impacts Group is really focused on helping communities prepare for the consequences of climate change that are currently unfolding on our landscape and in our communities. And I'm both hopeful as well as concerned. Hopeful because we have so much scientific knowledge and practical knowledge about local risks and vulnerabilities. I showed that sea level rise tool, I showed the heavy precipitation tool. I didn't talk about the culverts tool or all of the other reports or tools for tribal communities that we've helped co-develop with those communities. And there are other ways that we've delivered local data that can be used in assessing risks and preparing for climate change. In addition, we have so many colleagues and other engaged professionals across all levels of government and across so many of the communities in Washington state that are really working to build the knowledge and implement the action that's needed to effectively prepare for climate change. But we don't currently have the high level of attention that this topic really needs. And we really need the recognition that the time that we have to prepare for these consequences is getting shorter and shorter. We still have time to safeguard our communities, to reduce emissions, and to build resilience across our state and across our region. And I'm really excited for those of you who were able to join today to talk about thinking about how we can put our best foot forward as we work, to combat this very significant societal challenge. So thank you. Happy to take questions.
I have a question. I'm Scott Mock. I'm the superintendent of Chimacum School District, and I'm really delighted that you came. Delighted is the wrong word. I'm grateful you came. This is a terribly upsetting topic for all of us, and it will continue to be in the future. My question is about developing a plan for resilience. You may know that our school districts in the county have about, 10% of our county's population, and a lot of our other families are associated. And we have lots of statutory requirements to prepare for the future, so safety plans, that kind of thing. And those statutory requirements don't come with resources, but they come with lots of requirements. So whether it's drilling, developing plans, all of the things that we have to do, none of them have to do with the future of climate change. So my question is, what is the group doing to lobby for resources, time, help with supporting K-12 education to deal with this impending set of challenges, and impending, I mean like now, because we are already overwhelmed, we are already underfunded, and COVID is revealing that at a level that none of us had thought. So because we have so many children and families in our purview, I'm curious about what can be done, what the group might do by way of helping us get the resources, because the people in this room will be helpful partners. They will not have the resources to support us. This is a governmental support system. So thanks for.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So our group in the past has worked with, and I have to go back and look at this, and I'm happy to share resources by email, Seattle Green Schools, and they were working directly with educators to provide resources to teachers, sort of like a training where the material was geared towards K through 12 students rather than being sort of for end user decision makers. So that is available. I can't speak articulately to it off the top of my head as it's been a few years, but happy to follow up by email to provide you with some of those resources that would be useful. But you're also totally right that a lot of what, getting back to your point of being resource poor, a lot of climate adaptation can be what we call mainstreamed into existing governmental institutions, structures, and policies. And the benefit of that is it's acknowledges that the majority of, like you articulated, agencies, institutions are capacity poor. So acknowledging that and saying, but there are these structures and these programs and these policies within these institutions that potentially could have climate resilience folded into them, right? One potential example would be thinking about the Shoreline Master Program, which Ecology is currently working to have guidelines for communities on how to include sea level rise into that program. The big caveat there is that it's not mandated, it's not required, right? And that's different than like what's being done down in California. So there isn't sort of that legal teeth of that document, but they are working on providing resources to communities on how they can go about incorporating it into that document. However, that does sort of put the burden back on the communities and those responsible for developing it themselves, which is obviously a challenge for resource poor communities. Cindy, I see
Cindy,
you.
yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for a great presentation, and thanks for all the great work UW Climate Impacts Group is doing. I'm the chair of the Jefferson County / Port Townsend Climate Action Committee, and we use your research quite a bit and have developed some tools related to it. So many thanks for that. One question for you is, when looking at the different greenhouse gas scenarios going forward, I saw you were showing both RCP 4.5 and 8.5. At this point, it seems like, unfortunately, we're very much on track for the 8.5 scenario. So is that what you would recommend for folks who are looking at doing some of that modeling?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that we get a lot. And I think what I would say is that the way we use those greenhouse scenarios is they're like what scientists use as plausible what if scenarios to define the future. I'd say if you're doing a vulnerability assessment where you're kind of exploring where your sore spots are, I would suggest looking at both. Right, you want to consider the range of possible futures, and then ultimately it's going to come down to a risk tolerance situation. Do you want to design for a sort of worst case scenario and ensure that you're investing in something that's going to be resilient regardless of the outcome, or you perhaps don't have the resources to design for that, and you could also look at sort of the higher end of the RCP 4.5. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it, but I wouldn't say as a blanket statement, if you're doing exploratory vulnerability assessments, to solely look at RCP 8.5, but also acknowledging that we as a society are currently on that trajectory.
Do we hear any other questions from the group? Burning questions here? No? Okay, then thank you so much to all of you who have participated, and thank you, Harriet, for this fabulous information. That visualization tool is awesome, and I know that that is going to be well utilized in the community, and we hope that you will not be a stranger, that you will come back on a regular basis and give us some updates, and we look forward to being able to get that presentation and sending it out along with the link to this video. I want to take this opportunity to just let you know that, as we were talking about early on, that this month by default has ended up being Climate Impact Month for Jefferson County. Our next cafe on October 15th is going to take this climate impact that we've talked about today and take it hyper-local. Speaking that day will be our new Jefferson County DCD, the Department of Community Development Director, Brent Butler, as well as our long-range planner, David Johnson. Because I'm on Planning Commission and work with them on a regular basis, this is really the focus of all of us right now, working with Department of Ecology. And it's what's going on locally is as exciting as what's going on regionally and in our state and nationally. And the only thing missing in some cases is funding. So I think we're working on that in government even as we speak, but it's an ongoing challenge for all of us. A few days after our presentation, I think on the 20th of October, the Jefferson County Historical Society is going to produce a virtual event, which they'll also host in video later on their website, communicating climate change through art, science, and education. And information about that can be found on the Historical Society website. And we have just a minute or two now at the end of this presentation for anybody else on this call who might have something going on at their organization that they would like to share with us. This is the opportunity to tell us what you're involved in, the events that you're holding, what you're thinking about, what information you might need coming up. I'm not seeing any hands waving frenetically in my face. So, Eric.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Great, thanks. My name's Eric. I work here at Jefferson Land Trust. I'm the stewardship director here, and I thank you, Harriet, for the great presentation. And I guess I wanted to let everybody know here that Jefferson Land Trust embarked on a resiliency study, a spatial resiliency study this last year, about a year and a half, to help us determine as a land conservation organization where in our landscape that we work in Jefferson County are the most resilient lands. What is the available data sharing and showing us about the land forms and the portions of our landscape that have the highest likelihood of retaining some of their conservation values, some of their most important ecological functions, some of the biodiversity. But also as a land trust, we work with agricultural land conservation, we work with forest land conservation and shorelines, and also community conservation. What are going to be important? What kind of land bases are going to be important for future generations that are otherwise threatened by climate change, which is a lot of places. And so we have the results of that study that we've produced, and it's really helping drive our attention and focus with our new acquisitions as a land trust, as well as our ongoing stewardship of the properties we've already helped protect. So I want to let everybody else know that we've been moving ahead on this. We have a few presentations we produced, and we're going to be creating a web page on our website soon to describe this and post a few links that will give you more information about that. We did this in partnership with the North Olympic Land Trust. It's one of the things we're doing as a land trust, looking at partnerships and looking at things with climate change in particular, who can be good partners in some of these endeavors and our strategies of what we're going to do as one of our community institutions that, you know, are paying a close attention to this and trying to do some good work around it. So that's just a heads up for everybody, and I'd be happy to talk more about that and share our results and our spatial analysis as well.
Thank you, Eric. That's great that you're sharing that information, and we look forward to be able to link to that on your website when that gets up. Yeah, that's exciting. So seeing no other hands, I want to thank once again Harriet for the great insights into this ramping challenge that affects us all in so many ways. And we will definitely keep in touch. We will share her presentation along with the YouTube link and the links to those tools that she had in the chat with all of you, probably no later than Monday. We want to thank all of you for joining us today, for your questions. We hope that the information that you've received from here today will lead you in a great direction for your organizations, and that we maybe will help all work together to sort of get this challenge a little more under control than it is right now. We hope you'll share the link to the information with the people in your organization and in the community that you believe it might help, and that you join us for future cafes and workshops. And you can stay informed by, when you find this link, clicking on it and subscribing to the Chamber's YouTube channel. Please stay safe and stay healthy, and most of all, please help our community in Jefferson County. Shop local. Thank you all. Have a great weekend.